In 1975, the American tobacco industry was the most profitable it had ever been. By 1985, it was in structural decline. Domestic consumption was falling. The cultural tide had turned. The industry needed somewhere for the epidemic to go. So it went to Asia. Not because Asian consumers chose it, because the US government made them an offer they legally couldn't refuse. For most of the 20th century, the American tobacco industry was about as close to untouchable as a business could get. It was culturally embedded, politically connected, and extraordinarily profitable. Cigarettes weren't just a product, they were infrastructure. They were in every film, every war photograph, every break room in America. And then slowly, they weren't. US domestic cigarette consumption fell by over 20% between 1975 and 1994. Not a dip, a massive decline with no floor in sight. The industry wasn't just losing customers, it was losing the cultural argument. Surgeon General reports made the link between cancer and cigarettes go mainstream. Advertising bans started to spread. Smoke-free spaces were becoming normal. And these weren't temporary headwinds. Educated consumers were quitting. Young people weren't starting so much. And the domestic ceiling was now visible to everyone inside these companies. Internal Philip Morris documents from 1977 already show executives framing international markets as the company investing for the future. And that's the language of someone who knows the gravy train is over. A 1982 internal analysis goes further. It explicitly names the drivers for new demand as the population explosion in many underdeveloped countries and the continuing emancipation of women. Aha! They weren't looking for markets that wanted cigarettes. They were mapping which populations hadn't been reached yet. Women in developing countries weren't a demographic. They were a gap in the spreadsheet. The clinical detachment of this language is the point. This isn't a company panicking. This is a company that's starting to execute a master plan. So by the early 1980s, international expansion wasn't optional for these companies. It was the only structural answer to a contracting domestic market. The epidemic wasn't going to shrink. It was going to move. The only question was where. And the answer to that question wasn't left just to the market. It was decided in Washington. Section 301 of the US Trade Act is a legal mechanism that allows the United States to threaten retaliatory tariffs against any country it accuses of maintaining unfair trade practices. It's a blunt instrument. The implied message is, open your market or we make your other exports expensive. In 1985, US Trade Representative Clayton Yutta used it to target Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and Thailand. The official charge, they were protecting their domestic tobacco monopolies with high tariffs and distribution restrictions, which was unfair to American exporters. The unsaid thing. The US government was at the same moment running domestic anti-smoking public health campaigns. The same government, the same decade, threatening trade war to force other countries to accept cigarettes. Here's what forcing open actually looked like. Previously, Japan had a 26% tariff on American cigarettes. It was abandoned in 1986. Taiwan and South Korea lowered tariffs and eased distribution restrictions. These weren't negotiated compromises reached over diplomatic dinners. They were countries backing down under the threat of the USA ruining their other exports in entirely unrelated industries. The outcomes were immediate and measurable. US cigarette exports to these Asian countries rose 600%. In Japan, cigarette imports tripled in a single year, 1987. In Taiwan, US market share went from 1 to 20% within 2 years of tariffs dropping. In South Korea, American companies captured 6% of the market within 1 year of opening in 1988. These numbers don't describe a market that was waiting to be served. They describe a market that was pried open. Yutta's own characterization of the export growth? A marvelous success story. Meanwhile, the Department of Health and Human Services was given, in their own words, no role whatsoever in the formulation of trade policy. And when Surgeon General C. Everett Koop tried to convene a meeting specifically on tobacco trade policy in 1988, the White House and Congress blocked it before it ever happened. Koop later called this the height of hypocrisy. The US was pleading with foreign governments to stop exporting cocaine while simultaneously threatening trade war to export tobacco. The mechanism is now visible. A declining domestic industry used state power to create captive new markets. The government was not neutral. It was the delivery vehicle. But not every country accepted the delivery quietly. Thailand refused, flat out. The Thai government called the US pressure tobacco colonization. It's not wrong. It maintained its import ban and dared the Americans to escalate. So the US escalated. It filed a formal complaint with GATT, the predecessor to the World Trade Organization. This was now a test case. If Thailand won, every country in a similar position had a legal template for resistance. If Thailand lost, the door was closed. And this is what the US argued at the GATT hearings. Thailand's import ban wasn't really a health measure. It was a fig leaf to protect the Thai domestic tobacco monopoly from foreign competition. And the slightly uncomfortable thing here is that's kind of true. Thailand did have a state monopoly. The ban did protect it. The US wasn't entirely wrong on that fact. But the Thai counter-argument was the one with the longer consequences. letting in aggressively marketed American brands with their advertising budgets, their lifestyle imagery, their deliberate targeting of women and youth, was a public health threat of a different order than the domestic monopoly the World Health Organization backed Thailand's position, specifically noting that international companies used marketing budgets that domestic monopolies simply couldn't match. The domestic Thai cigarettes were described as harsh, high in tar, weakly advertised, whereas American brands were intensively advertised and explicitly associated with modernization, sophistication, wealth, and success. Not just a product, the full cultural package. In 1990, the GATT panel delivered its ruling and went against Thailand. The import ban was not necessary under the relevant article because Thailand could achieve its health goals through less trade restrictive measures. Thailand was forced to open its market, but it was permitted to keep its advertising restrictions. Here's the part that doesn't fit the simple story. Thailand took the ruling, opened the market, and then doubled down on every public health tool it still had. Smoking rates in Thailand fell from 26% in 1992 to 20.5% in 1999. So the lesson isn't that the GATT ruling was fine, it's that market access and public health policy are different levers. And the countries that treated them as the same lever lost both fights. Thailand separated them, and it worked, which raises an uncomfortable question about everywhere else. Let's think again about that 1982 internal document, the one that listed the continuing emancipation of women as a driver for new demand in developing markets. That phrase is doing a lot of work. In Japan, in 1986, female smoking stood at 8.6%. That's not a market. In the language of that document, that's an opportunity. American brands weren't just entering these markets, they were invading them with a specific target already in mind. By 1991, 5 years after Japan opened its market, female smoking rates had risen from 8.6% to 18.2%, more than doubled in half a decade. The World Health Organization documented that multinationals used marketing budgets that domestic monopolies couldn't come close to matching, and that the targeting of women and youth was deliberate and systematic. The cultural framing was the product. American cigarettes weren't sold as cigarettes in these markets. They were sold as symbols of the thing these societies were being told to want: modernity, independence, and Western sophistication. The cigarette was almost incidental. This is the mechanism the 1982 document was describing. Not exploitation as an accident. Exploitation was the plan, written down, filed internally, and executed ruthlessly. And the thing is, this had all happened before. Women and children were the market that grew the cigarette industry in the early 20th century in America. And here it was boomeranging back around to the same audience, but in Asia. Overall cigarette consumption in the targeted Asian countries rose more than 10% within 2 years of market liberalization. And in 1993, R.J. Reynolds CEO James Johnston put it in the company's annual report. Access to world markets had grown from 40% to 90% in a single decade. And in his words, opportunities have never been better. That sentence was written for shareholders. It was describing the same thing Coop was describing when he called it the height of hypocrisy. They were just looking at it from opposite sides of the equation. The domestic American market was contracting because public health information had reached American consumers. The export strategy was, structurally, a bet that it would take longer to reach Asian consumers and that the industry could extract value in that window. The human cost isn't abstract. It's a specific demographic. Women in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, whose smoking rates were used as a performance metric in corporate annual reports. And the system that made all of this possible wasn't dismantled. It was described as a success. Now, you may be familiar with the first Opium War, where you may be thinking, what's something called the Opium War got to do with this? It turns out, a lot. So let's oversimplify the first Opium War so we can get to the important thing here. The British East India Company had a trade imbalance with China. They had a product, opium, grown in India that generated enormous profit. China banned it. The British government used military force to override that ban and keep the trade open. They called it a dispute about free trade. The product was addictive. The target population paid the long-term cost. The commercial interest extracted value and left. That's the structure. Now run it again with different nouns. Western commercial interest with the product causing domestic harm. Check. Target governments that had explicitly restricted or banned the product. Check. Thailand's import ban, Japan's tariffs, South Korea's monopoly protections. State power used to override those restrictions. Check. Section 301, GATT complaints, diplomatic pressure. The justification framed as free trade in both cases. Check. The difference that matters. In the 1980s, the US used Section 301 and GATT complaints. The mechanism is cleaner. The outcome rhymes. Now, here's the part that makes this more than just an abstract comparison. The feedback loop that should have stopped it was deliberately blocked. Coop's meeting shut down. HHS excluded from trade policy formulation entirely. The one institution in the US government with the standing to say this is causing measurable harm to foreign populations was structurally prevented from entering the conversation. This is why this story isn't about bad people making bad choices. The system was designed so that the people making trade decisions never had to look at the health data. The information was blocked at the institutional level. Clayton Yutta wasn't lying when he called it a success. His job was trade, and by trade metrics, it was. The harm was someone else's problem. And that department had been locked out of the room. The countries that resisted, Thailand above all else, were told their resistance was protectionism dressed up as public health. And the US institution that might have validated their public health argument on the American side had been silenced before it could speak. So once the domestic American market started contracting and the industry had access to Section 301, the export of the epidemic wasn't just a possibility. It was the only rational move available from their point of view. And the government was going to help make it happen. So going back to my oversimplified Opium War story, it's way more interesting than that in reality. Was the British Empire evil for pushing opium on Chinese people? Maybe. But that war is really the endgame of two empires with opposite goals and pressures. Watch this to see how two flawed systems combined to create a war no one wanted. Bye!